Chapter 10. It ain't bragging if you really done it. On the whole, the 30-odd residents of Monterey Square regarded their neighbour Jim Williams with a respectful friendliness. Several were on his Christmas party invitation list. Others were more wary and kept their distance. Virginia Duncan, who lived with her husband in a townhouse on Taylor Street, for example, still remembered the chill she felt when she came out of her house 2 years ago and saw a swastika hanging from Williams' window. John C. Levy, a retired architect, had fought a number of acrimonious battles with Williams, all concerning what Williams described as Levy's destructive incompetence in matters of architecture and historic preservation. So Mr. Levy had no use for Jim Williams, but the Levy-Williams feud was a mere quibble compared with the Cold War that raged between Williams and his next-door neighbours, Lee and Emma Adler. The Adlers lived in an elegant double townhouse that occupied the other two of the trust lots on the west side of Monterey Square. Their side windows looked directly across Wayne Street at Williams's parlour and the ballroom above. It was the Adler's howling dog that had prompted Williams to play his thunderous version of César Frank's Piece Héroïque on fuck's sake. It was the Adler's howling dog that had prompted Williams to play his thunderous version of César Frank's Piece Héroïque on the organ. But the dog's bark was only one sour note in the whole medley of bitterness that existed between the two households. Lee Adler, like Jim Williams, had played a central role in the restoration of Savannah's historic downtown. His approach was entirely different, however. While Williams' efforts had involved the restoration of his own houses, Adler had been an organiser and a fundraiser who left the actual restoration work to others. Adler had helped create a revolving fund for the purpose of buying old houses that were in imminent danger of being razed. The houses were then sold as soon as possible to people who promised to restore them properly. Lee Adler's accomplishments had been so successful and his participation so energetic that he had emerged as a national spokesman for revolving funds and historic preservation. In recent years, he had turned his attention to renovating old houses for poor blacks. He toured the country making speeches. He was elected to the board of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He lunched at the White House. His name frequently appeared in the New York Times and national magazines. Now in his mid-50s, Lee Adler was probably the best-known Savannaian outside Savannah. Lee Adler's national prominence inspired a fair amount of resentment in Savannah. It was widely felt, in Savannah at least, that Adler's manner was bombastic and premonitory. It was widely felt, in Savannah at least, that Adler's manner was bombastic and peremptory, that he was an autocrat, that he stepped on toes needlessly. He was accused, openly and behind his back, of taking more credit than was really due him for the renaissance of Savannah. It was said that he hogged the limelight, that he was insincere, and that his only interest in historic preservation was to use it as a means to gain fame and make money. Jim Williams was among those who felt this way about him. Adler and Williams were outwardly civil. But just barely. Adler had been a member of the Tailfair Museum's board of directors when Jim Williams was president, and from time to time their animosity spilled out into the open at board meetings. On one occasion, Adler accused Williams of stealing furniture from the museum. Williams denied it and countercharged that Adler was trying to blacken the name of anyone who had more power over the museum's affairs than he did. Eventually, Williams engineered a plot that forced Adler off the board, and Adler never forgave him. Williams was contemptuous of virtually everything about Lee Adler: his taste in art, his word of honour, even his house. A visitor once rang Williams' doorbell by mistake and asked if Mr. Adler was at home. Williams told the man, "Mr. Adler doesn't live here. He lives in half of the double house next door." Lee Adler was no less disparaging of Williams. He believed him to be fundamentally dishonest and said so. Furthermore, he suspected the Nazi flag episode was more than a light-hearted attempt to foil a crew of movie makers. He had let it be known that a letter addressed to Williams from the John Birch Society had once been delivered to his house. Adler was critical of Jim Williams' decadent lifestyle, but he was just curious enough about it to get his binoculars out and spy on Williams' all-male Christmas parties. Adler had clumsily forgotten to turn out the light behind himself and was silhouetted in the window. Williams saw him, waved, and drew the shutters. In spite of all this, there were restraining factors that kept the two men on civil footing most of the time. Lee Adler was Leopold Adler II, grandson of the founder of Adler's department store, Savannah's answer to Saks Fifth Avenue, and his mother was a niece of Julius Rosenwald of the Sears Roebuck fortune. Emma Adler was the sole heir to the biggest block of stock in the Savannah Blank. Emma Adler was the sole heir to the biggest block of stock in the Savannah Bank. She had been president of the Junior League and was an active member of several civic organizations. So the reality of the situation was that both Jim Williams and the Adlers were prominent, influential, and rich. They lived in such close proximity and moved in so many of the same circles that they felt obliged to remain on cordial terms, which is why, despite his loathing for them, Jim Williams always invited the Adlers to his Christmas parties, and why, even though they detested Williams in return, the Adlers always accepted. Early one bright April morning, Lee Adler came toward me with a broad smile on his face and an arm outstretched in greeting. "Shake the hand that is going to shake the hand of the Prince of Wales," he said. Mr. Adler was making a jocular reference to an article in the morning paper announcing that he and his wife would be travelling to Washington at the end of the week to meet Prince Charles of England. The Adlers and the Prince were to participate in a discussion of low-income housing. Adler assumed I had read the article, and of course I had. Most of Savannah had read it, and to judge from Mr. Adler's most of Savannah had read it, and to judge from Adler's ebullient mood, he either did not know or did not care what certain people were saying about it. "It's just another of Leopold's cheap, self-promotional ploys," Jim Williams said. But the rolling of eyes and clearing of throats was not limited to people who disliked the Adler. Catherine Gore, a lifelong friend of the Adlers, also found the news distasteful. "I would like to meet Prince Charles too," she said, "but I would never stoop so low to do it. Low-income housing indeed." Adler and I were standing in Adler's office on the ground floor of his townhouse. This was the command post from which he directed his many projects in real estate and historic preservation. A telephone rang in another room. Somewhere, a copy machine churned. The walls of his office were decorated with memorabilia of Adler's role in the remarkable renaissance of Savannah's historic district. The photographs documented parallel transformations that had taken place over the past 25 years. Savannah regaining the splendor of its youth, and a youthful Lee Adler progressing by stages into silver-haired middle age. Adler wore half-moon glasses and a pale, rumpled summer shirt. His speech was a soft, cajoling drawl. We had met a week earlier at a garden party given by a local historian, and Adler had offered to take me on a tour of Savannah to show me, stage by stage, how Savannah had been saved from the wrecker's ball. As we got into his car, he let me know that he was aware of all the carping going on behind his back. "Do you know what they're saying for the day it is?" he asked. "It ain't bragging if you really done it." He gave me a meaningful glance over the top of his glasses, as if to say, "Never mind all the backbiting you've been hearing. It's sour grapes." We pulled away from the curb and began moving through the streets at 10 miles an hour. As we did, the visual treasures of Savannah flowed by in slow motion. Townhouses, mansions, shadowed gardens, and well-tended squares. "Picture all of this deserted and empty," said Adler. "Imagine it run down, windows broken, weatherboards unpainted and rotting, shutters falling off, roofs caving in. Think what the squares would look like if they were nothing but hard-packed dirt instead of grass and azaleas and beautiful landscaping. Because that's the way it used to be. That's why Lady Astor called Savannah a beautiful woman with a dirty face when she came here after the Second World War. That's what Savannah had allowed itself to become. And that's frightening. And what's frightening is, while it was happening, nobody gave one goddamn." A truck behind us honked its horn. Adler pulled over to let it pass, then kept moving at a slow pace, continuing the story of Savannah's decline. Until the 1920s, he said, Savannah had remained basically intact, an architectural, exquisite 19th century town. But the flight to the suburbs was just beginning. People moved out of the lovely old houses downtown. They cut them into apartments, tore them down, or just boarded them up and left them empty. In those days, all the money was being funneled into the development of the suburbs, which was fortunate for Savannah in one respect. It meant there was no clamour to bulldoze massive areas downtown for housing developments. Nor did Savannah have superhighways slicing through the centre of it the way other cities did, because Savannah was not on the way to somewhere else. It was, geographically, the end of the line. In the mid-50s, almost a third of the old city was gone. Then, in 1954, the owners of a funeral parlour announced plans to knock down a dilapidated tenement so they could use the space for a parking lot, and a number of concerned citizens rose up in protest. The tenement happened to be Davenport House, one of the finest examples of federal architecture in America. It was a shambles at the time. 11 families were crowded into it. 7 ladies got together, Lee Adler's mother being one of them, and saved Davenport House and restored it. They then formed the Historic Savannah Foundation, and that was the beginning of Savannah's salvation. In the early days, Historic Savannah had a vigilante committee that sounded the alarm when an old house was about to be demolished. But the committee had no power to prevent demolition of houses, or even to gain a stay of execution. All it could do was try and find some sympathetic soul to try and buy the endangered building and restore it. Most of the time, the house came down before the committee could find anybody to save it. It soon became clear that the only way to save the old houses was to buy them, and that's when Lee Adler became involved. "I was having breakfast one morning," he said. "It was December of 1959. I read in the newspaper that a row of 4 townhouses on Oglethorpe Avenue was about to be torn down. They were lovely, built in 1855. They were known as the Mary Marshall Row. It was the same old story. A local wrecker had bought the houses in order to knock them down and sell the bricks. The bricks! You see, they're Savannah grey bricks, which are larger and more porous than ordinary bricks, and they have a very soft and beautiful color. They were kilned at the Hermitage Plantation on the Savannah River. They're not made anymore, and you can't duplicate them. They were selling for 10 cents each at the time, more than 3 times the cost of an ordinary brick. Anyhow, the wrecker had already demolished the carriage houses, and the townhouses themselves would be gone in a matter of days." Adler pulled over to the curb on Oglethorpe Avenue, in front of Colonial Cemetery. A Across the street stood a handsome row of 4 brick townhouses, each one with a stoop of white marble steps leading up to the main entrance on the second floor. The bricks were a muted greyish red. "There they are," he said, "fully restored. When I came to look at them that day, the windows were out, the doors were gone, and the steps were in bad shape. The bricks from the carriage houses were piled up in the backyard. I went into one of the houses and climbed into the 3rd floor and looked out at the magnificent view, and I thought, this cannot be allowed to happen." Adler paid a call on old Mr. Monroe, the wrecker, and told him that he wanted to buy the whole row. Mr. Monroe told him that he could get the bricks to him in 6 weeks. "I don't want you to touch those bricks," Adler replied. "I want you to leave them right where they are." Mr. Monroe agreed, but said Adler would have to buy the land too. He could have the whole row, bricks and land, for $54,000. So Adler and the other 3 men signed a note for it. They then wrote a prospectus and took it to the Historic Savannah Foundation, which had 300 members at the time, proposing that the foundation buy the row at a cost of $180 per member. "My idea," said Adler, "was that the foundation would resell the houses to people who would agree to restore them. Historic Savannah went along with it. That was the beginning of the revolving fund." It happened that the poet Conrad Aiken had lived as a child in the house right next to Marshall Row at number 228, the house in which Aiken's father had shot his mother and then himself on that terrible morning in February 1901. Having spent most of his life up north, Aiken wanted to come back and live his last years in Savannah. So a millionaire friend, a man named Hy Sobiloff, bought and restored the house on the end of Marshall Row for Aiken and his wife Mary. It was number 230, the house next door to the one Aiken had lived in as a boy. "When work was completed on the house," said Adler, "the contrast between it and the other 3 was startling. I went to the phone and called a newspaper and said, 'Do you want to see a miracle? Come on.' So they came over and they did a big feature on it on their Sunday edition. This was February 1962. We had an open house the day the story appeared. It rained, but something like 7,000 people came through the house. They wore the shellac off the banister. We let them go into the unrestored house next door, too, for a before and after comparison. And they saw for the first time how a dilapidated wreck could be transformed into something marvelous. When that happened, we started to get some interest. People began to see the potential. They began to think about moving back downtown. Of course, it didn't hurt one bit that Savannah's greatest man of letters, a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, was leading the way. We resumed our drive. Adler pointed out dozens of houses that had been saved, describing in detail their once fallen condition. The porch on that one was completely gone. The house had bright green asbestos siding and aluminium awnings. The roof on that one was rotted through. He was like a doctor reviewing the case histories of former patients, now fully recovered. Adler's success with Marshall Row encouraged him to go out and raise money for a revolving fund to be used by the Historic Savannah to save other houses in the same way. The concept was very simple. Historic Savannah would use the money to buy endangered houses, then resell them, at a loss if necessary, to people who would sign a pledge to begin restoration within 18 months. The foundation set a goal of $200,000 for the fund, enough money in those days to save a lot of houses if they were turned over quick enough, and they were. But even with the revolving fund, it was a struggle, said Adler. I'd come downtown every day and breathe in the air and plot out the day's fight. And indeed it was a fight. because some of the buildings were still coming down pretty fast. Sometimes we won, sometimes we lost, and the voters of Savannah gave us no help at all. They rejected urban renewal 3 times because they thought it was a communist plot, and they defeated any number of proposals for historic zoning ordinances. That monstrosity over there, for example, was one of our biggest losses, the Hyatt Regency Hotel. We were riding along Bay Street, passing in front of the Hyatt, a squat modernist building set next to City Hall. The Hyatt had once been a great cause célèbre in Savannah. The building had taken a great chunk out of the row of 19th century cotton warehouses along Factor's Walk, and its backside jutted out over River Street, interrupting the line of facades along the riverfront. The public battle over the hotel delayed its construction for 10 years. "You can see the hotel is all wrong for the site," said Adler. "We fought it in the courts, and let me tell you, it was a bruising battle. Both of the developers were members of the Historic Savannah Foundation. The sister of one of them was acting director. The organization was split right down the middle, practically destroyed. It was a very emotional time. I remember going to a wedding while all that was happening, and when I walked in, I realized I was suing everybody in the room except the bride and the minister." At about that time, restoration of the historic district was nearing completion. Over 1,000 houses had been restored. The work had been done by affluent whites, but Adler insisted that blacks had not been displaced. Historic Savannah was buying empty buildings for the most part. But when the supply of unrestored houses in the historic district began to dwindle, the next logical step was to restore the houses in the neighbouring Victorian district. And that would have been a different story. We drove south on Abercorn Street. Within a few blocks, the restrained architecture of the historic district gave way to late Victorian flights of fancy. Big old wooden houses with romantic towers, gables, and elaborate gingerbread trim. A few were restored, but most were in very poor condition. The Victorian district was Savannah's first streetcar suburb. It had been built for the white working class between 1870 and 1910. After World War II, when the whites moved further out into the suburbs, absentee landlords took over, and by 1975 the area had become a black slum. The houses were in deplorable shape, but they were still beautiful, and in recent years speculators and upper-income whites had started buying them. At that point, Adler became alarmed. "It would have meant gentrification and massive displacement of blacks," he said, "and I was determined to prevent that. I asked Historic Savannah to help find a way to restore this area without evicting the people who lived here, but Historic Savannah was still busted up over the Hyatt, and they weren't interested in the housing problems of poor people. That's when I quit Historic Savannah. I launched a non-profit organization called the Savannah Landmark Rehabilitation Project, which has been a triumph because the board includes everybody, black, white, you name it, rich and poor." Adler's intention was to get houses out of the hands of absentee slumlords and convert the Victorian district into a racially and economically diverse neighbourhood. It occurred to him that the project might qualify for public assistance, and thus far, by using a combination of public and private funding, he had bought and renovated 300 units. Tenants paid 30% of their income in rent, and the rest was made up by federal rent subsidies. "I don't suppose I need to tell you," Adler said, "that not everybody is happy about what we're doing here. Some people complain privately about poor blacks living in a subsidized housing so close to the historic district. A few people, like Jim Williams, have even spoke out publicly against it. Jim Williams says we're dealing with the criminal element. I take it you've heard of Jim Williams? Yes, I said. I've met him. Do you know about the Nazi flag incident? He told me about it, I said. He said it draped it over his balcony to interrupt a film being shot in Monterey Square. That's right, Adler said. He had all those little faggots hanging the swastika out there and moving it from window to window. On Anderson Street, Adler stopped in front of a freshly painted grey and white house. Now I'm going to introduce you to an example of our so-called criminal element. We climbed the steps and Adler rang the bell. A black woman in a flowered house dress came to the door. Morning, Ruby, said Adler. Morning, Mr. Adler, she said. Adler introduced me to Miss Ruby Moore. Ruby, I brought this gentleman to see what life is like in the Victorian district. If you don't mind. Oh, that'll be fine, she said. Come on in. Ruby Moore's duplex was cool inside. It had 3 bedrooms, a modern kitchen and high ceilings. There was a small garden in the back. A portrait of John F. Kennedy hung over the living room mantel. Adler led me on a quick tour, upstairs and down. Then we rejoined Mrs. Moore in the front hall. These houses were pitiful before they fixed over, she said. I never dreamed they would look anything like this after they got through. While they was redoing them, I was over here every day looking, because I knew I was going to get one. I really do appreciate my apartment. I really do. It's got central heat and air. Is everything okay, Ruby? Adler asked. Oh, yes, she said. Then she turned to me. Would you sign my book, please? The guest book lay open on the table in the living room. As I signed my name, I noticed that I was not the first outsider to be brought into this house by Lee Adler. A reporter from the Atlanta Constitution had signed a few spaces above. We got back in the car. Adler told me that Ruby Moore's qualification for his apartments, Adler told me that Ruby Moore qualified for one of his apartments because she was a long-time resident of the Victorian district, because she worked, she was a housekeeper at the Days Inn, and because her income was below a specified level. She paid $250 a month in rent, and federal subsidies covered the rest. Adler said that Mrs. Moore more than satisfied his inspection staff. Her house was always immaculate, and she was the rule rather than the exception. We're not interested in housing the whores or the gamblers or the dope dealers, he said. We headed back into the historic district. I could show you another 100 apartments just like that one, but you probably get the picture. Once we got it going, private investors started buying houses and property values began to rise. The Victorian district has been acclaimed as a national model for how to restore inner cities without uprooting the poor. We sponsored a national housing conference here in 1977, and 400 people came from the 38 states. The next year, Rosalind Carter came down and taped a segment of Good Morning America in one of our renovated apartments. And this Friday, we're off to Washington to explain it all to Prince Charles. We entered Monterey Square and swung around it counterclockwise, coming to a stop in front of Adler's house. Well, there you have it, he said. Historic preservation used to be an elitist hobby, something rich dilettantes. Historic preservation used to be an elitist hobby, something rich dilettantes dabbled in. But we turned it into a grassroots operation. In the process, we created a $200 million tourist industry and brought people back downtown to live. Not bad, huh? Quite an accomplishment, I said. Adler looked at me over the top of his half-moon glasses. It ain't bragging if you really done it.